Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our online talk this evening, a walk through time in Kensington Gardens. My name is Laura McMahon. I'm the Community Learning Officer for the Royal Parks. And for those who don't know, the Royal Parks is a charity and we support the 8 Royal Parks in London. So they're Greenwich over in East London. In the Central Parks, we have Hyde Park and Kensington Gardens, Richmond, St James's Park and Green Park and Regent's Park. And over in the west, we have Bushy Park and Richmond Park. We also look after some other green spaces like Victoria Tower Gardens and Brompton Cemetery as well. So thank you so much for joining this evening. I think we've got about 200 people signed up to talk this evening. Let me see how many have we got joining us already. So we've already got a great amount of people joining us, so hopefully we'll have some more. But if you have been to any of our talks before, you'll know we've done a few online talks already. Some are broad topics where we look at the histories of some of these parks. Some are very niche where we look at maybe women's history or how to ID trees, but we have quite a lot of stuff happening and you can go and check this out on our website. But this a walk through time series, this is our second one. Our first one was in St James's Park and now we're doing Kensington Gardens. Next month, I believe we're doing Green Park. So you can sign up to that up on our website shortly. But these are free events, but we do ask for donations. So if you can, if you haven't donated already, please consider giving us any donation that you can. This helps us to stay open and free to everybody who comes to visit the Royal Parks. My colleague Charlotte, I think, will be putting the donation in the Q&A. Okay, so just a bit of housekeeping before we get started. The talk will be about 45 minutes and there'll be about 15 minutes for questions and answers at the end. So if you have any questions or just input that you'd like to have as part of the talk, please feel free to use the Q&A function. Probably up in the top right hand corner of your screen, and you can pop them in there and I'll have a read through at the end and I'll read out some of the questions people ask. A caveat before we start though, I'm not a historian. My background is actually fine art and horticulture, but I have been working for the Royal Parks for about 4 years now and I've just been gathering lots of stories while I've been here. So I will just be giving you the highlights, the quick run through of Kensington Gardens, a whirlwind tour of Kensington Gardens, but there's many more talks that you can see on our website that will go into more areas in greater detail. Okay, have I gone through everything? I think so. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so Kensington Gardens. So it is a lovely green space we have in West London and it's 265 acres. And it's home to some of the most iconic memorials and spaces in London. So just to give you a bit of a bearings as to where we are in the park. So here we have the Albert Memorial. Over up here we have the Serpentine Gallery and the Sackler Gallery. We have Buck Hill here and the Long Water and Serpentine. So fun fact, the Serpentine really is the whole thing, but on this kind of more long, narrow area on the Kensington Garden side, it's called the Long Water. You have the Italian Water Gardens, we have the beautiful Peter Pan statue, we have the Round Pond, and of course, we can't talk about Kensington Gardens without talking about Kensington Palace. So that's where we're going to start our tour today. All right, so this is Kensington Palace, and this is where, if we were doing a normal walking tour of the park, this is where I would meet you. And of course, without Kensington Palace, we wouldn't have Kensington Gardens. So the history of Kensington Palace is quite interesting. It was built in 1689. Originally, it was called Nottingham House. And the monarchs at the time, newly crowned William III and Mary II, were looking for somewhere to be close enough to court, but not too far away, that it took a lot of time to travel in. So the place where court was at the time, where the monarch officially resided, was Whitehall Palace. which is where we have the government buildings, where 10 Downing Street is, just beside St James's Park. Now, it was a very old palace. It was quite smoky. It was in, central London, and it wasn't a great place for them to be. I think William may have been in ill health as well. So they wanted to set up a family home that was close enough that they could get easily to Whitehall, but wasn't so close that it was in the kind of smoky, damp area of the city. So they asked the architect. Christopher Wren to build the extension for Kensington Palace. Now, Christopher Wren is the architect actually who built the St Paul's Cathedral that we know today. And as you can see, it was built in brick rather than stone. And this was done for two reasons. One, it was much cheaper. And two, they wanted to get it built very quickly. They were very keen to move in as quickly as possible. And quickly they did actually move in. It was completed within 6 months. And they actually moved in on Christmas Eve on 1689, beg your pardon. And over the next few years, they extended it further. They added a gallery. The Queen's apartments was put in. And this is actually one of the rooms of the Queen apartments that you can go and visit if you go to Kensington Palace, which is managed by the Historic Royal Palaces. And they also built a new entrance too. Now, they had gardens as well. So you can't have a palace without gardens, right? So the original Kensington Gardens was much smaller than what we know today. And it was this kind of Dutch style formal planting that was put in that was very popular and that William had brought over with him. And it's really interesting, I think, looking at this illustration of the time, seeing that Kensington Palace was actually in the countryside, where we think of Kensington as this bustling area of London. But this was the countryside just outside London. And they opened up the gardens to the public when they went to Hampton Court. Now, the public obviously not being the likes of me and you, but this would be more like the aristocracy would have been allowed to go and promenade through the gardens. Now, unfortunately, William and Mary didn't have long to appreciate the beauty of Kensington Palace and their gardens. Only a few years after the build, Mary came down with smallpox and she died. And then only a few years after that, in 1702, William fell off his horse, broke his collarbone, and then his injuries actually caused his death a few days after that. So this beautiful palace that they built very quickly for them to move in, but unfortunately they didn't get long to enjoy it themselves. So after the death of William, in moved in the new monarch, Queen Anne. And here's a portrait of Queen Anne, and probably one of her most famous depictions in the recent movie, The Favourite by Olivia Colman. An absolutely fantastic movie, and definitely recommend watching it. Queen Anne was an amazing woman, but along with her reign, she was not a fan, supposedly, of William, and she really detested the Dutch style gardens that he put in. So she tore the gardens down and replaced it with her own style of garden. And as well as that, she also took over 100 acres of space around the park. So we're starting to see that extension of the gardens happen. And that was actually an enclosure for her deer and antelope that they had so that they could hunt. Which just seems crazy to me. Just a nice sport of hunting some antelope in Kensington. But alongside the enclosure for her deer and her antelope, she also built the orangery that we see today. So the orangery is actually a beautiful restaurant now. It's just to the right of Kensington Palace if you're looking at it face on. And I'd like to imagine if you ever are lucky enough to go in there, it's a very, very fancy place and it's lovely for afternoon tea. I like to imagine that this would have been what Queen Anne would have experienced back in her reign, surrounded by beautiful orange trees and having some afternoon tea. So we're going to move on to another queen. Actually, we've got a bit of a royal flush of queens to look at how Kensington Gardens became the park really that we know today, and that had a lot to do with Queen Caroline. So here's Queen Caroline, and she was the wife of George II. And in 1728, she took over almost about 300 acres of the extended of Hyde Park, which was next door, and turned that into the bigger gardens of Kensington Gardens. And she separated it with a long ditch, or a haha as it was called, and that boundary I'll show you in the map is actually still today with West Carriage Drive, the road that runs between the two. So a lot of the features that we see in Kensington Gardens is because of Queen Caroline. Here you can see Queen Caroline's temple, and this is, you can see this, I'll show you in the map, it's just to the west of the Long Water, and this would have been a building that would have been used for picnicking by the Queen and her court during the summer months. A really beautiful space. I think there's actually some graffiti from the 1800s there that you can still see. There's definitely some modern graffiti in there too, but it's a really interesting place to go and visit. As well as that, she also developed, she also built the Serpentine that we know today. So here you can see we have the Serpentine. So this is all to do with Queen Caroline. And just over here is the Queen Caroline Temple, if you ever want to go and visit it. And this is the split. So this is the land that she took over. So this is the split of Kensington Gardens and Hyde Park that actually came about because of Caroline. So when she wanted this large body of water to be put in, the Serpentine as we know today, the style that it was put in was very different to what the style of waterways and landscape architecture was like at the time. At the time, it was very formal. You would have had straight avenues of canals, and the planting was very formal. But when Queen Caroline brought in a new style of landscape, which was much more naturalized. So even though the Serpentine itself is a man-made lake, it looks more natural because of the shaping was put in, the edging plants, the native planting that was put in, and that was all to do with Queen Caroline. And it was actually built, it was originally the Westbourne stream, and it was dammed to create the Serpentine. So the next time you're on the Hyde Park side of the Serpentine, you'll see beside the Dell, you'll see you're up on quite a hill, and that is because it has literally been dammed in to create this artificial lake. And actually there you'll see the very small memorial for Queen Caroline, which I don't think quite does her justice. She was a fantastic woman, and I apologize for people who joined us on our protest and power walk only 2 weeks ago. I talked quite a lot about Queen Caroline, but she's a very interesting woman. She was so politically influential that when her husband George II would go back to Europe or wasn't able to reign, he signed a Regency Act that meant his wife, Queen Caroline, rather than his son, would be regent, so acting monarch while he was away. She also brought over extremely intelligent people to court, like Voltaire and Sir Isaac Newton, and even introduced inoculation of smallpox into Britain, which I think is very fascinating, especially when we think today of COVID. So at the time, smallpox was running rampant. It was killing people, whether they were poor or rich, and there wasn't really a cure. But in Europe, they were realizing that you could inoculate yourself by lancing. It's quite graphic. You had to lance the boil from someone with smallpox, and then take that boil, make an incision in the arm of a healthy person, and put in that boil. Sounds quite gross, but the idea behind it was that the disease would slowly spread through the bloodstream rather than being inhaled, and it would give the body enough time to produce the antibodies needed to fight off the infection. And after some very dubious testing that was done first on convicts and then secondly on orphaned children, Queen Caroline actually inoculated her younger children and had a ball to celebrate their health, to show the court that they were well after this inoculation, so that people would feel confident in inoculating themselves. So she's a fantastic woman and had a lot to do with Kensington Gardens that we know today. But moving on to yet another queen, I think this is our last queen before we move on. We're going to talk about Queen Victoria, because she had a lot to do with Kensington Gardens. So this is outside Kensington Palace. You can see a memorial for Queen Victoria, and this is an unusual memorial because it's one of the only ones where we see Queen Victoria as a young woman. So Queen Victoria, we see her, usually we think of the mourning queen, think of her all in black and quite portly. This is one of the only sculptures we see of her actually as a young woman, and this depicts her on her coronation day. So this is in celebration of 50 years of her coronation. It was actually created by her daughter, Princess Louise. So her daughter, Princess Louise, was a sculptor, and she sculpted this of her mother, which I think is quite beautiful. And the reason why it's outside Kensington Palace is because Queen Victoria was born and raised in Kensington Palace itself. So here you can see this is actually a self-portrait of Queen Victoria that she did of herself when she was a teenager in Kensington Palace. So she was born at around 200 years ago, and her father died when she was 1 year old. And it became obvious that she was going to be the next in line for the monarch for the crown after King William died. So King William at the time was in poor health, and Queen Victoria's mother and her advisor, Sir John Conroy, knew that they would be acting as regent if the king passed away while Victoria was still a child. So they raised her in a very strict system that was called the Kensington system. She wasn't allowed to socialize with anyone outside of the household. Her mother had strict control over her social occasions. She wasn't allowed to go to court. Her mother even slept in the same room with her until she was 18 years old, and she was said to even not be allowed to go up and down the stairs by herself. She had to have someone holding her hand at all times. Now, King William didn't really like Queen Victoria's mother and didn't really trust her and didn't want them to end up having the power of regency. So he actually declared that he would stay alive until Queen Victoria turned 18 so that she would rule directly. And actually, King William actually died 1 month after Queen Victoria turned 18. And at that stage, she ascended the throne and she actually moved out of Kensington Palace, unsurprisingly, with the experience that she had there. But Kensington Gardens still remained loved in her heart, and you can see that in some of the memorials that we'll talk a bit about later on. Okay, so we're going to go on a quick jaunt now. So we've started over here at Kensington Palace, and we're going to cross the Broad Walk over to the Round Pond. Now, the Round Pond is actually a bit of a misnomer because it's not round at all. It's actually a rectangle that's with rounded edges, excuse me. But we're going to talk a bit about that. So this is the Round Pond, really beautiful, iconic pond in Kensington Gardens. And originally it was built to house turtles for George I. So George I, like many of the monarchy, loved exotic animals, as we saw with Anne with her antelope. So he had a menagerie that supposedly had civets, which are a very strange creature. Give it a Google if you want to see what they look like, tigers. And inside the pond, he had turtles that were, I'm sure, used to be very ornate, but were also used for the pot. Turtle soup was very popular at that time. Then after that, it obviously no longer has turtles in it. It might have the odd tortoise that someone might have thrown in, but as time went on, it became a space for model boats. And this is set in the Victorian times. This picture comes from the Victorian Edwardian times, where model boats were very popular. And they still are today. We still see some model boats out on the Round Pond. And just giving a bit of a teaser to what we'll talk about later, the author J.M. Barrie, the author of Peter Pan, was a constant patron of the Kensington Gardens. He would walk around quite a lot, and I do like to imagine that he would see these model boats and maybe was inspired to create the character of Captain Hook and their pirates. Okay, so now we're going to go for a bit more of a lengthy walk. So we're going to go from the Round Pond down, and then we're going to land here at the Albert Memorial. So the Albert Memorial was built after Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband, died at the age of 42. We don't know his exact cause of death. It was written down as typhoid fever because Queen Victoria refused to allow for an autopsy to be done. But he did die quite young. But during Queen Victoria's reign, there was a lot of mistrust about this foreign prince. But he became much more popular towards the end of his life. He was a patron of many arts, and he had massively influenced the Great Exhibition, which was housed just right next door in Hyde Park. And the Great Exhibition was a celebration of all the amazing achievements all around the world, but really in achievements of Britain really was celebrated mostly, of the Industrial Revolution that happened massively during Victoria's reign. And that was housed in the very famous Crystal Palace that ended up getting moved to South London and Sydenham, and that's why we have the Crystal Palace now today in South London. But after the Great Exhibition, they wanted to make a memorial for Prince Albert for his achievements with the success of the Great Exhibition. And actually, the Great Exhibition was such a success, and just down south of the Albert Memorial, we have Exhibition Road, and that's where we have the Science Museum, the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Natural History Museum, the Imperial Museum. All of them came out from the money generated from the Great Exhibition in Hyde Park. So all to do with Albert, and that's why it actually gets nicknamed Albertropolis quite a lot, that whole area, because of the impact that he had. So this is obviously where the memorial for Albert had to be made. But this memorial was quite a huge undertaking. It took quite a few years to be achieved. It was designed by George Gilbert Scott, and it was unveiled in 1872. It was actually, the money was raised by public subscriptions. And Queen Victoria really wanted a large memorial for her husband. She absolutely loved her husband. We know that through her diaries. And when he died, she was said to be very distraught. She wore black for the rest of her life, and stayed in continual mourning. Now, the actual memorial itself is very symbolic, and I'm not going to go through all the details of it because it would take a whole thing in itself. And we actually did a talk not too long ago about the Albert Memorial. My colleague Charlotte will probably share the video now in the Q&A if you want to watch that separately. But there is massive symbolism around this memorial. Up at the top, these angels symbolize the virtues that Albert extolled. We have down here, we have, these are the sciences are represented. This frieze of Parnassus represents all of the artists at the time. So there was painters, sculptors, architects, writers, because Albert was such a patron of the arts. And down here as well, we have each of these four corners represent the four continents, even though we know there's 7 continents today. The 4 continents of the world are represented on the cornerstones here. And the Albert Memorial is got obviously Albert in the middle, holding a catalogue from the Great Exhibition. Now, it is a beautiful memorial. It's actually the 2nd largest memorial in the world for a consort of a monarch, the largest being the Taj Mahal in India. But I like to think that this kind of very Gothic style memorial wouldn't have sat too well with Albert, because when the Great Exhibition ended and they were trying to initially have a memorial or a celebration of him, a statue of him, he actually said he wouldn't want one because it would disrupt his daily horse rides around the park, and he wouldn't like the idea that people would see him and recognize him. So don't know if he would have appreciated it, but we appreciate it today, and I'm sure Queen Victoria did at the time too. Okay, we're going to move on through the park now. And as we're walking, we're going to walk towards the Longwater. And as we're walking, we'll probably hear some very loud squawking and maybe a flash of green coming through the sky, and that would be because of these birds. So these are the ring-neck parakeets that we have in our park, and they are now ubiquitous in all of London and surrounding us as well. And the stories behind how parakeets ended up in London and in the parks are legendary, really. They're not native to this country. They're native to like the Tibetan mountains. And there's many stories of how they ended up here. One of my favorite, I'm going to go through a few, but one of my favorite ones is Jimi Hendrix, who lived in Carnaby Street in Soho back in the 60s. He was said to have released a mating pair of parakeets, and all of the parakeets in London are supposedly descended from this mating pair. I mean, that's obviously not true, but I like to think of that story. Also, the African Queen was filmed at London as well, and it was said that some of the exotic birds that were used on set were escaped as well. But there's some countless stories of collection birds that have been released accidentally or on purpose throughout the years. But whatever reason, we have these birds now, which some people find invasive, and they do take over some natural spaces. Some people absolutely love them, but whether you love them or not, they're here to stay, and you will see them as you're walking through. And I quite like stopping by and having a look at them, especially when we're doing a Peter Pan walk, because it seems only fitting to when you're talking about pirates and fairies that you have a parrot that might possibly land on your shoulder. But besides parakeets, if we were back in the 1940s, we would have seen another unusual animal in the park. And that would have been some sheep. So hard to imagine, but up until the 1940s, it would have been very common in the central rural parks to see sheep roaming around. And I love that these people here over by the Long Water at the Lido having a cup of tea, and there's some flock of sheep beside them. And the reason for this was what we used to mow our lawns. They were the natural lawn mowers of the time. And obviously nowadays we have them replaced with our lawn mowers and our tractors, but this was how we mowed our lawns up until the 1940s. And I talk about it because we've actually in recent years done a new trial of having sheep back as mowers in our park. So we've done, for the last 3 years, we've done trials in Green Park, so our neighbouring park. Here we have Tom, he's from Mudchute City Farm in Surrey Keys, and he works specifically with rare breed native sheep. And these sheep were brought into our parks to look after a wild meadow space. So their job, they were fenced in and they into our wild meadows, and they were allowed to just graze. And the idea was that sheep were better at picking out kind of the more stronger plants that might take over a wild meadow. So you can see here this sheep eating some thistles. So a lawnmower will cut everything out, and then obviously the stronger plants will grow up quick. And that won't allow for the more delicate plants to grow up, and it means you don't have as much biodiversity. So to increase our biodiversity and also being aware of climate change and not being too resilient on machines, we are trialing out having sheep maintaining our green spaces. So who knows, maybe in a few years you might see sheep back in Kensington Gardens. So from sheep and parakeets, we're going to move towards the Long Water, and we're going to talk about the beautiful statue that is there, the Peter Pan statue. So the Peter Pan statue is a bronze statue that was a sculpture of J.M. Barrie's iconic character, Peter Pan, the boy who never grew up. And it was actually put in, the way it was put in was very unusual. So this wasn't put in with permission, there wasn't a ceremony. J.M. Barrie actually commissioned an artist himself to create this bronze sculpture and put it in like in the dead of night, came in, it was put in, and he actually announced on the 1st of May in 1912 in the newspaper that this was here in the park, and actually read out what was written at the time. So he wrote into the newspaper saying, "There is a surprise in store for the children who go into Kensington Gardens to feed the ducks at the Serpentine this morning. Down by the little bay on the southwestern side of the tail of the Serpentine, they will find a May Day gift from Mr. J.M. Barrie. A figure of Peter Pan blowing his pipe on the stump of a tree, with fairies and mice and squirrels all round. It is the work of George Frampton, and the bronze figure of the boy who never grew up is delightfully conceived." So I just think it's fantastic that not only did J.M. Barrie give us Peter Pan the story, but we also have Peter Pan the statue that he just popped into the park without permission. And it is a fantastic sculpture. And at the top of the sculpture, you can see Peter Pan as the boy, and we think a lot of the movies of Peter Pan. We know him as this cheeky boy, and the boy was actually based on the real life boys that J.M. Barrie befriended in Kensington Gardens, the Lewins brothers, beg your pardon. And here's a picture of Michael modelling for the sculpture. And not only was he inspired by these two boys that he met in the park, but he was massively inspired by Kensington Gardens. And actually, the first Peter Pan official, I think second maybe officially, Peter Pan novel that was written was actually called Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens. And it's absolutely beautiful book, and I recommend you read it. And here's one of the illustrations from the book. And in the book, you can see Peter Pan isn't the boy, he's actually a baby, because in the story goes that he woke up in his nursery and he didn't want to grow up, and he flew out of the nursery and landed in Hyde Park at Bird Island. And in the story, it said that babies actually come from birds, and all parents would write letters and send them to Bird Island to ask for a baby to come, which I think is quite a quaint story and quite cute. And the story goes that, yeah, Peter Pan was still able to fly because he still thought he was a bird, landed on Bird Island, tried to still be a bird, but quite realized he wasn't a boy, but he wasn't a bird. He was somewhere in between, and he would never grow up. And so he built himself a boat using the help of all the birds who were good at making boats like nests. And he used his pajamas as a sail, and he sailed across the stormy Serpentine and landed in Kensington Gardens, where the fairies would come out at night time. So, an absolutely beautiful story. And you can actually kind of see through the illustrations exactly where he came from. So there is Bird Island, and he sailed underneath the bridge, which we can see in this illustration. And he came and landed exactly here. And in the illustrations in the book, you can see exactly where it is in the park. The railings are the exact same. And that is where the Peter Pan statue lives today. So the next time you're in Kensington Gardens, have a look around and think about how J.M. Barrie was inspired to create the Peter Pan stories that we love and know today. Okay, so we're going to move on now. So we're moved on from Peter Pan, and we're going to walk a little bit up, and this is to the Italian water gardens, or the Italian gardens as they're called. And the Italian gardens are this elaborate mix of, they're not really gardens as such as we would think of them today. They're actually mainly 4 basins of water that have these beautiful fountains coming out. And they're built in this Italian style. And there's all this beautiful Italian marble and stone. And this actually came because of Prince Albert. So we can think about down south of Kensington Gardens, we have the Albert Memorial that Queen Victoria got commissioned to be built for Prince Albert. But the Italian Water Gardens was actually a kind of a love song from Albert to Victoria. And here we've got some vases and this beautiful ornate architecture. There's all these beautiful architecture you can see. And this is looking on to the Long Water itself. So Albert was a keen gardener too, and he brought a lot of Italian inspiration with him, like these raised terraces and fountains and urns in geometric shapes, and he brought them with him in 1860 to Kensington Gardens to build the Italian water gardens. Now, if you've ever been there before, you will probably have seen this, and this is, it's this beautiful building that you see when you come in from Bayswater Road. And in quite Victorian style, it's very ornate, very beautiful. But I love this because, like most Victorian buildings that you see, they actually served a very utilitarian purpose. So even the most utilitarian things in the Victorian era were actually done up in a beautiful way. And the actual reason for this is actually a pump house. So as I said earlier on, when Queen Caroline commissioned for the Long Water and the Serpentine to be created, originally it was Westbourne Stream that fed into the lake. However, by the 1860s, beg your pardon, London was going through its industrial revolution, and the stream became extremely polluted. So they actually had to stop get water coming in from the river feeding into the Serpentine. And what they did in a very industrial Victorian way, instead of creating maybe a well or a borehole to fill that space, what they did was they originally pumped water from St. James's Lake, so on quite a slope. If you ever walk from St James's Park all the way up to Kensington Gardens, it's quite a distance and it's on a slope. And they had a pumping system built to pump that water up the hill into the Serpentine. So this beautiful building that we see today, where you can sit in and look quite nicely on the Italian gardens, actually all had to do with a pump system. And if you are there, I thought I could get a photo, but unfortunately I couldn't get a photo close enough. But if you are going there, you will see up at the top, just here, you will see a V and an A, and they are for Victoria and Albert. All right, moving away from these lovey-dovey Victoria and Albert, we're going to move over to another artwork, the Arch by Henry Moore. So this stage, we're going to walk down this side of the Longwater. We're going to end up here at the Henry Moore Arch. So the arch is a 6-meter high sculpture made by the very famous artist Henry Moore, and it's made out of this beautiful Roman kind of style of architecture, and as with all of Henry Moore's artwork, it's very natural, very organic shape, and it frames this beautiful view of the view going up to Kensington Palace. And actually, if you're standing at the top of Buck Hill, which is the grassy area behind where this photo is taken, and you look through the archway and to Kensington Palace, this is actually one of the longest uninterrupted views in London that hasn't got buildings in front of it. It is a very beautiful place. Lots of people go there to take pictures. And Henry Moore himself actually gifted this to the people as a public artwork and put it in the in Kensington Gardens because he had his 80th year celebration of his birth, and there was a big exhibition of his artwork in the Serpentine and Sackler Gallery. So after that was finished, he commissioned for this artwork to be put here with this beautiful view. In 1996, because it became quite unstable, I think it's 7 large blocks that are 37 tons, it became unstable. So they actually had to take it down. And I think it was back in 2016, perhaps, that it was finally restored back into the parks itself. So you may have seen the Henry Moore Arch if you've been to the parks before, but what you probably haven't paid much attention to is the grassy area behind it. And it seems a bit innocuous. You wouldn't really think there was much happening there, but I'm going to talk to you about the historical impact of this space. So here is a picture from the early 1900s of Buck Hill. So just to show you the map, this is Buck Hill today, and you have the Italian Gardens, and you have the Longwater, and here it is back in the early 1900s, and it looks pretty much the same as it does today. And only these little tiny squiggles on the grass that you see here give an indication of what this might have been used for. And it was used for trenching. So during World War I, trenching became an extremely important part of the war effort. It was said that a soldier couldn't join the war if he didn't have the same instinct of a rabbit, which is to dig. So trenching was very important. So the Royal Parks and Kensington Gardens especially was used by the army to train soldiers on how to dig their own trenches before they went to the front line. And this is actually, though it may look like the front line, and this is actually in Kensington Gardens itself. This is the demo trenches that was built in Kensington Gardens at this time. And along with building these trenches, they had to think of another thing that was very important in World War I that hadn't had to be used before, and that was camouflage. So we think of war and we think of camouflage, and they seem very obvious to us. But pre-World War I, camouflage wasn't really used. The tactics of war was 2 armies, very much in their brightly coloured uniforms, facing each other for battle. But this changed in World War I because of the introduction of airplanes. So airplanes hadn't really been used in any wars previous to this time. And alongside having aerial bombing, you also had aerial surveillance. So your tactics that you had on the front line, if you were going to move all your soldiers to one area for attack, aerial surveillance could very easily see what you were up to. So they had to figure out ways to camouflage what they were doing and also trick the opposite side into thinking they were doing something they weren't. And this was all about camouflage. And they actually set up in Buckhill in Kensington Gardens in this space a camouflage school. And they actually commissioned artists and set designers to come in and think of ingenious ways that they could trick the opposite side as to what they were doing. I love this image here. We have 4 soldiers in Kensington Gardens at the trenches, or so it may seem. And if you look closely, you'll see in the middle, this gentleman here, he looks a bit different, doesn't he? And that's because he isn't a man at all. He is, in fact, a dummy's head. And this was one of the many ways of camouflage that was done during World War I, and that was invented in the camouflage school in Buckhill in Kensington Gardens. And women, of course, were massively important with the World War I and the war effort, and they were creating these camouflages. So we see pictures of them in Buckhill weaving these grass nets that would have been thrown over soldiers or thrown over the trenches. And we even see here these women making these dummy heads that were used in the front line. But alongside being used for camouflage and for trenching and for soldiers to practice during World War I, Kensington Gardens was also massively used for food production. So at this stage, I would normally bring us just behind Buckhill into a little secret garden that a lot of people don't know about. And this is Kensington Garden allotments. So you can go in there. It's open for people to come in throughout the day. We have some lovely chickens there, and we have vegetable patches where we're growing fruit and vegetables. We have a little orchard. And we have volunteers that look after this space, and you can go in and volunteer if you ever have an opportunity. But this is a replication of the show allotments that happened in Kensington Gardens during World War I. So during World War I, before World War I, beg your pardon, Britain was actually extremely reliant on imported food. They realised that it was cheaper to import food from the Commonwealth than it was to produce at home in Britain. So I think 40% of all of the food consumed in Britain at the time was being imported. So with the war happening, obviously there was big embargoes happening with the surrounding of Britain, and so food wasn't able to come in. So they had to think very quickly about how they could become more self-sufficient. So the ideas of allotments, of people growing their own food, became a new notion. And show allotments were set up all around Britain, where people could come and learn about where they could grow their own food and how to grow food very quickly and efficiently. There's no point in growing an apple tree when you can't eat that for like 4 or 5 years. And as well as these show allotments, we also saw actual allotments that were set up. So quite a large amount of Kensington Gardens was taken over for allotmenting in this space, along with the soldiers practicing for the front line. And I love this illustration so much. We have Kensington Palace right here, and right in front of it, you have people growing their own food. I mean, it's hard enough to get an allotment in London now, but can you imagine having an allotment in front of Kensington Palace? So the food growing scheme of World War I wasn't that successful. It took quite a while to get set up and established, and they had to make a lot of mistakes they learned throughout that journey. But it wasn't until World War II that we have the Dig for Victory campaign happening, and that's when we really saw people growing food in a bigger scale. And we can still see that that happened as well in Kensington Gardens. So again, a lovely picture. This was taken in 1942. It's an Imperial War Museum picture. And you can see this woman and this warden digging trenches for potatoes instead of for soldiers, right in front of the Albert Memorial, and putting some manure down to feed their crops. And I think that's such a great place to end our talk. We've gone from the highs of the monarchy and we've gone down low to the manure. But whatever the story it is, I think that just shows the joy of Kensington Gardens. Originally a lovely retreat for the monarchy, but then really became a park for the people. So that is my talk. I hope I haven't bored you too much. Thank you so much all for listening. So I'm going to now turn off my presentation and see if we've got any questions from people. So if you have any questions you want to ask me, feel free now. If you have any stories you want to input, please do. I'll read through them now. Let me get back here. Okay. All right, so I'm going to have a read through some of the questions that we've got coming through. Oh, everyone's being very quiet today. I haven't had any questions coming in. It's very unusual. All right. Let me see. Have I missed any? Great. Someone's asked about the video that the Albert Memorial talk that we had, and that one you can find on our YouTube channel. So Charlotte's put up there. We've got quite a lot of our videos. Some of our talks we've been putting up on our YouTube video, our YouTube channel, so you can find them and watch them. We'll be putting this one up as well. Probably tomorrow, maybe the next day, but you can check that out there. But what I will say to you is just a few things before we finish up then, if nobody's got any questions. So you will receive an email from us maybe tomorrow or the next day, and that will include our link to our newsletter. So if you haven't already signed up to the newsletter, please do. You'll get information about all our upcoming events. You'll also get a link to our new talks that we're going to have coming up. So we have our virtual Easter activities happening during Easter half term. So we'll be doing lots of family activities there, all the things that you can do at home to get outside and enjoy nature during Easter. So you can look out for that. We'll also be doing our podcast. We have our podcast coming out, I think this week or next week, and that's all about women's history. My colleague Lucy is going to be interviewing our colleague Dan, who works in Brompton Cemetery, looking at amazing women who were involved in the suffragette movement. We have Emmeline Pankhurst, for example, was buried in Brompton Cemetery. So you can find out more about that. And in April, I will be delivering a walk on wild food in nature. So at this time of year, we've got amazing wild garlic and nettles and lots of amazing culinary and medicinal plants that are starting to come through. And I'll talk to you a bit about how you identify these plants safely, recipes you can have for them, and how to do so within the law as well. So there's a few caveats with foraging and how to be respectful for the environment that you're foraging in. So I'll go through that. I think that's at the end of April. And the next a walk through time will be a walk through time in Green Park. And though it's quite an overlooked park, I think there is amazing histories there that you can find out about. You can hear about Queen Victoria's assassination attempts that happened there. You can hear about how it got its name, a very dubious background of how Green Park got its name, all to do with a mistress. And there's many different stories that will come out there. So hopefully you can join us there. Will the recordings be available? Yes, Marina. So we will have them up very soon, probably tomorrow, but in the email that I send you, it'll have a link to the recording. So please do share it with anyone that you think would find it interesting. But if there isn't any other questions, let me have a quick glance before. Brilliant. Oh, what happened to the gate going out of Kensington Gardens beside the Serpentine Bridge and opposite the cafe? Oh, beg your pardon. I can't. Don't actually know about that one. I'm struggling to imagine what that is, Jonathan. Beg your pardon. So thank you all very much for joining. I hope you all found it very interesting. If you haven't already and you can, please do consider donating to the Royal Parks. We really appreciate your support. Like most green spaces, we've seen a massive surge in people coming into our parks during COVID as people need to get out and appreciate nature, which is so important for our health. So if you can, please donate so we can stay open and free for all. But that's it from me. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we'll hope to see you in another talk soon. Thanks very much. Good night.